Salt and Silk, a novel of desire. Salt and Silk, a novel of desire. A story in 5 parts. Contents. Part 1, Marrakesh. Chapter 1, The Riyadh. Chapter 2, First Taste. Chapter 3, The Hammam. Chapter 4, What We Ate. Chapter 5, The Souk at Midnight. Part 2, Istanbul. Chapter 6, The Bosphorus. Chapter 7, His Hands. That evening, almost by accident. The Riyadh's owner, a French woman named Colette, who had lived in Marrakesh for 20 years and spoke a French that had absorbed entire Arabic grammars into its syntax, told them about a private terrace that overlooked the Atlas Mountains, accessible through a passage behind the souk that most tourists never found. "Go at sunset," Colette said, stirring mint tea with an energy that belied her 60 years. "It's the most beautiful view in the city, and bring wine if you must. The mountains don't judge." They brought a bottle of Moroccan red and climbed through a passage in the Medina that was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The walls closed in, then opened suddenly onto a terrace that jutted from the top of an ancient building like the prow of a ship. Below them, the Medina spread in a maze of rooftops and satellite dishes and the occasional burst of bougainvillea. And beyond, the Atlas Mountains stood in the fading light, their peaks dusted with early snow, the sky above them burning through shades of gold and amber to a deep, impossible violet. "Oh," Lena breathed. The word was insufficient but honest. They sat on a low bench at the terrace's edge, their shoulders touching, the wine between them. The air had cooled enough to be gentle, and the sounds of the city below, the traffic, the voices, the distant muezzin beginning the evening call, rose to them like a chorus. Kofi poured the wine and they drank in silence for a while, watching the light change. Then he said, "Tell me about the Bach. Why that piece? Why the saraband?" She considered the question. "Because it's honest," she said finally. "Most music tries to impress. The saraband doesn't. It just tells the truth about what it feels like to be alive, which is mostly about not knowing what happens next. Every phrase resolves and then doesn't. Every question leads to another question. It's music that admits it doesn't have the answer." "And you find that beautiful?" "I find it the only honest thing." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, a hand on her skin, a pressure that made her aware of herself in a way she rarely was. She was 34 years old. She had performed in concert halls across 4 continents. She had been praised and desired and occasionally loved. But she had never felt herself so precisely seen as she did in that moment, on that terrace, with the last light of the Moroccan sun painting his face in shades of copper. "I want to kiss you," he said. Not a question, not quite a declaration, a statement of fact, like announcing the structural load a column could bear. "Then kiss me," she said, and the words came out braver than she felt. He set down his glass. He turned to her and cupped her face in his hands, those large, careful hands that she had watched touch plaster and stone, and pressed his mouth to hers. The kiss was slow. Low at first, exploratory, as though he were mapping the shape of her lips the way he mapped the dimensions of a room. Then she leaned into him and the kiss deepened, his hand sliding from her face to the back of her neck, tilting her head, opening her mouth with his, and the taste of him was salt and wine and something underneath that was purely him. She pulled back just enough to breathe and said, "That was," and he kissed her again before she could finish. And this time there was no hesitation, no exploration, just a mutual surrender to something they had both been building toward since the moment he had stood in the doorway of the Riyadh and listened to her play. His hand slid down her spine and pressed her against him, and she felt the length of his body against hers through the thin fabric of their clothes, his chest, his stomach, the hard line of his hip. She brought her hands up to his shoulders and felt the muscle there, the solidity of him, and something inside her that had been clenched for months, for years, began to release. They kissed on that terrace until the stars came out, until the mountains disappeared into the dark, until the city below them was a constellation of lights. His hands learned the geography of her, the curve of her waist through her dress, the line of her jaw, the place below her ear where a touch made her shudder. She learned him too, the breadth of his back, the rough warmth of his cheek against her temple, the sound he made when she bit his lower lip. "We should go back to the Riad," she whispered against his mouth. "We should," he agreed, but neither moved. She kissed him again, tasting the wine on his tongue, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, fast, urgent, the rhythm of something that had moved beyond words. His hand found the hem of her dress and slid upward along her thigh, and the touch sent a current through her entire body that made her gasp into his mouth. "We should," she said again, breathless, and this time they stood, gathering the wine bottle, laughing softly at the clumsiness of desire, and walked back through the narrow passage with his arm around her waist and her hand pressed flat against his chest, feeling the architecture of his ribs beneath his shirt, the structure that held him together. The walk back through the Medina felt longer than the walk out. Every corner was a new threshold. Every shadow was a space that invited. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew these streets, his hand guiding her around corners, pulling her close when they passed through narrow gaps. She was aware of every point of contact between their bodies, his hand on her hip, her arm through his, the brush of his thigh against hers as they walked. When they reached the Riad, Colette was gone, the courtyard empty, the fountain murmuring to itself in the blue-tiled darkness. He unlocked the door to her room with a gesture that asked permission, and she nodded, and they climbed the stairs together, their footsteps echoing on the tile, the sound of them together a rhythm she would remember for the rest of her life. Chapter 3. The Hammam. The room was small and white, lit by a single bulb that hung from the ceiling like a small, tired sun. A window stood open to the night, letting in the distant sounds of the Medina and a breeze that carried the scent of jasmine. The bed was wide, covered in a hand-woven blanket the color of terracotta, and when he closed the door behind them, the world outside ceased to exist. They stood facing each other in the half-light, the urgency of the terrace replaced by something quieter, heavier, more deliberate. The need between them was a physical thing, present in the room like a third person, but neither moved to close the distance. Not yet. "I want to take my time with you," he said, and his voice had dropped to a register she hadn't heard before, intimate, almost rough, as though the words themselves cost him something. "Then take your time," she said. He stepped forward and reached for the top button of her blouse, undoing it with the same careful precision she had seen him use on the plaster walls of the palace. One button, then another, then another. Each opening revealed a strip of her skin, the hollow of her throat, the swell of her collarbone, the shadow between her breasts. She stood still and let him undress her the way he had touched the walls, reverently, as though the act of uncovering was itself a kind of restoration, removing the layers that hid what was true. When the blouse was open, he pushed it from her shoulders and let it fall. Her bra was simple, cotton, practical. She had not dressed for seduction, but he looked at her with an expression that made her feel as though she were wearing silk. His hands rose to the clasp, and when the bra came free, his fingers brushed the bare skin beneath, and the touch was so gentle, so tentative, that she almost wept. "You're beautiful," he said. not with the hungry performance of a man trying to win something, but with the quiet astonishment of someone discovering a landscape. He brought his mouth to her breast, his lips closing over her nipple, and the sensation was immediate and sharp. A line of fire that ran from her breast straight down through her body. She arched into him, her hands finding his shoulders, gripping the linen of his shirt. He tasted her slowly, alternating between one breast and the other, his tongue deliberate, his breath warm against her skin. When he pulled back to look at her, she saw that his composure had cracked. His pupils were wide, his lips parted, and his hands, resting on her waist, trembled almost imperceptibly. "Come here," she said, and pulled his shirt over his head. His chest was broad and smooth, the muscles defined but not exaggerated, a body built by work, not by vanity. A faint scar ran along his left ribs, and she traced it with her finger. He caught her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over his heart, and she felt the organ beating against her palm, fast and insistent. "That's for you," he murmured. "It does that when you're near." She kissed his chest, tasting salt on his skin, and he drew a breath that shuddered through him. Then his hands were at her waistband, undoing the button, sliding the zipper down, and she stepped out of her skirt while he knelt before her and pressed his mouth to the place just below her navel. His hands guided her underwear down, and when she was bare before him, he paused and looked up at her from where he knelt, and the sight of him there, this man she barely knew, looking at her as though she were the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered, made something inside her break open. He kissed the inside of her thigh, soft and slow, working upward with agonizing patience while she gripped his shoulders and tried to breathe. When his mouth finally found her, the sound she made was involuntary, a cry that she muffled against her hand, but he pulled her hand away and shook his head. "Don't hide," he said. "I want to hear you." He tasted her with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything, slowly, learning her, pausing to feel her response to each movement of his tongue, adjusting, exploring. His hands held her hips, steadying her as her legs began to shake. She threaded her fingers through his shaved head and held on, the world narrowing to the point of contact between his mouth and her body, to the sound she was making, to the wet heat of him moving against her. When the orgasm came, it was not the sharp, focused peak she had learned to reach alone. It was a wave that built slowly, cresting and then building again, and when it finally broke, it moved through her entire body, starting at the center and radiating outward until her fingers and toes tingled and her vision blurred. She called his name, not loudly, not the theatrical cry of performance, but a sound that was purely involuntary, the sound of a body speaking its own language. He rose and held her while her legs found their strength again, and she pressed her face into his neck and breathed him, sweat, soap, the faint green scent of something herbal. He carried her to the bed and laid her down on the terracotta blanket, and she reached for him, pulling him down on top of her, feeling the weight and heat of his body settle over hers like a second skin. She undressed him fully now, the trousers, the boxer briefs, everything, and when he was bare above her, she wrapped her hand around him and felt him hard and heavy in her grip. And the sound he made was raw, almost wounded, as though the pleasure of her touch was also a kind of pain. She stroked him slowly, feeling the ridge of his shaft, the smooth head slicked with wanting, and he buried his face in her neck and breathed in ragged bursts. "I need you," she whispered. "I need you inside me." He rose above her, bracing himself on his arms, and looked at her with those warm, intent eyes, and she opened her legs and guided him to her. When he pressed inside her, the sensation was immense, a fullness that was almost overwhelming, the stretch and warmth of him filling her so completely that she gasped and her hands flew to his back, her nails scoring the skin above his hips. He held still for a moment, buried to the hilt, and she felt the pulse of him inside her, the evidence of his restraint, the effort it cost him to wait. Then he began to move slowly at first, deep, deliberate strokes that drew almost completely out before sliding back in. Each thrust pressed her into the mattress and sent a cascade of sensation through her body. She wrapped her legs around his waist and pulled him deeper, and the angle changed, and the pleasure shifted from pleasant to essential. Their bodies moved together with an instinct that had nothing to do with knowing each other and everything to do with wanting, the body's oldest language, its most honest music. He found a rhythm that was both patient and relentless, and she matched him, rising to meet each stroke, her hands on his back, his shoulders, his face, needing to touch every part of him while she could. The room filled with the sounds of their coupling, the creak of the bed frame, the slap of skin, their breathing, her voice rising in pitch as the pleasure built again, his low groan vibrating against her neck. He shifted to one hand and slid the other between their bodies, his thumb finding her clitoris with an accuracy that made her cry out, and the combination of him inside her and his thumb circling that precise point was too much, was everything, was the entire world compressed into a single point of white-hot sensation. She came with her face pressed against his shoulder, her teeth grazing his skin, her entire body clenched around him, and the orgasm went on, waves crashing over waves, until she was limp and gasping and barely conscious. He followed moments later, his hips driving forward, his whole body rigid as the release moved through him, his moan a sound that was half pleasure and half surrender. They lay tangled together in the terracotta light, breathing hard, their skins slick with sweat. The night breeze moved through the window, cooling the damp places where their bodies met. He pressed his lips to her temple, her eyelid, the curve of her jaw, and each kiss was a word she didn't need translated. That was, she started. "I know," he said. "No, you don't. That was the most honest thing I've ever done." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled her closer and pressed his face into her hair and said, "I know exactly what you mean." Outside, the call to prayer sounded for midnight, the muezzin's voice rising and falling in the ancient pattern, and they listened to it together in the dark, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist, his breath warm on the back of her neck. The fountain murmured. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and dust and the faintest trace of rosewater from the Riyadh's kitchen. She slept and woke and slept again, and each time she woke, he was there, his hand on her hip, his body curved against hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing the most comforting sound she had heard in years. Chapter 4. What we ate. She woke to the sound of his voice and the smell of coffee. The room was flooded with morning light, the single window framing a triangle of blue sky and the terracotta wall of the building across the alley. The bed was empty beside her, but his warmth still held the shape of his body in the sheets. She found him in the Riyadh small kitchen, barefoot, wearing only his trousers, making coffee in a metal pot over the stove with the ease of someone who had done this in 100 kitchens across 100 countries. Colette had left fresh bread, a jar of honey, a plate of figs and dates, and a small dish of amlou, argan oil with almonds and honey, the Moroccan peanut butter, thick and golden and sweet enough to make her close her eyes. "Good morning," he said, and the way he said it, low, intimate, with a smile that carried the memory of the night, made the ordinary words feel like a secret code between them. "Good morning." She sat at the small table and tore a piece of bread, dipped it in the amlou, and ate. The flavor was overwhelming, rich, nutty, the sweetness of the honey cutting through the depth of the argan oil. She had eaten it on her first day in Marrakesh and found it merely pleasant, but now, with his presence warming the room and the memory of his body still on her skin, the taste was transcendent. "Food tastes different when you're happy," she said, and then immediately felt embarrassed by the simplicity of the observation. "Food tastes different when you're paying attention," he corrected gently. He sat across from her and poured the coffee, thick, dark, sweetened with sugar he stirred in with a small spoon. "Most of us eat without tasting. We fill the body without listening to what it wants. My grandmother said that eating is the first meditation. You sit with the food, you notice the color, the smell, the texture. You let it tell you what it is before you put it in your mouth." He broke bread for her and placed it on her plate with the same care he had given her body the night before, and she realized that for Kofi, attention was the fundamental verb. He gave it fully to everything he touched, whether it was a crumbling palace or a woman's face or a piece of bread torn by hand. They went out into the souk after breakfast, and the city hit them like a wave, the noise, the colors, the press of bodies, the smell of spices and leather and raw meat and incense, and the ever-present sweetness of mint tea. He walked with his hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the narrow alleys, and she felt simultaneously protected and displayed. A woman walking through an ancient marketplace with a man who made her feel as though she were the only person in the crowd worth seeing. He took her to a stall where a man with a white cap and an enormous mustache sold olives in every state of preparation: green, black, purple, stuffed with garlic, stuffed with lemon, cured in oil, cured in vinegar, smoked, dried, cracked. Kofi spoke to the man in halting Arabic, laughing when the man corrected his pronunciation, and when the tasting was done, they left with a paper cone of mixed olives that they ate walking, tossing the pits into the street. In London, he said, I eat at restaurants and think about my grandmother's kitchen. The food is fine, better than fine, sometimes, but it's never exactly right. There's always something missing, and I think the thing that's missing is the moment. The moment of the food being made, the moment of it being shared, the moment of the hand reaching for the same piece of bread. Is that what this is? She asked. A moment. This is everything. This is exactly the kind of moment I've been trying to build my whole career. A space where two people can sit down and taste the world. He took her to eat msemen, the flat, flaky Moroccan crepes, fried until crispy on the outside and soft within, drizzled with honey and a sprinkle of sesame seeds.